Wow, that was arduous. So what I said at the beginning is it's odd at the end of a Vermont winter when we're all looking forward to spring and gardening and everything, to actually take an armchair visit to two places that get colder and stay colder for a lot longer than Vermont does. But that's what we're going to do. We're going to take trips to cold places. The rightmost green asterisk is Vermont. The middle one is Churchill, Manitoba. And the one way up in the north, in the top there, is the Kenai Peninsula of Alaska. And I had wanted to visit Alaska for years, decades, actually. It's a huge chunk of land. But I also love shorebirds. So I decided to time my first visit to Alaska with the 9th annual Kachemak Bay Shorebird Festival. It's in Homer, Alaska, which is on the western side of the Kenai Peninsula. I was going to spend about a week in Homer and then about a week wandering. This was my Bible. I cannot even guess how many times it led me to great locations and steered me away from dirt roads that just deteriorated into barely visible mud slicks to nowhere. So if you go visit Kenai, I would strongly suggest getting something like this. So I picked up a sturdy rental car in Anchorage, which is a big city, and I headed out on the only road heading south to the Kenai Peninsula to start an adventure that was full of 2 weeks, 6 warnings, and 3 adages. Highway 1 goes right along Turn Again Arm. Gorgeous. This area was first explored by and settled by Dena'ina people. They're one of the Athabascan language tribes. Russian fur hunters were probably the first European visitors. And later, the English captain James Cook explored this area. He was searching for the Northwest Passage, that magical and fictional sea route from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Upon reaching the end of what is now called Cook Inlet, after Captain Cook, the expedition saw 2 arms ahead of them. Yes, I didn't want to change that quite soon. And his second in command, the sailing master, was William Bligh, none other than William Bligh, the famous officer in charge during the mutiny on the Bounty. Well, Cook asked Bligh to take some of the boats and explore the left arm, which was sure to lead to the Northwest Passage. But it didn't. It just led to a very narrow river. So Bligh turned back, and then Cook asked him to explore the next arm, and he did again. And it also just led to a narrow river. And frustrated, Bligh called the second arm Turn Again River, because they had to turn again. And it later became Turn Again Arm. There are 3 volcanoes just across Turn Again Arm from Highway 1. And this was my favorite. This is Iliamna, almost always seen like this, venting some steam from near the summit. Now, people in the rest of Alaska call the Kenai Peninsula, and it's sort of sneering sometimes, Alaska Light. It has paved roads. Well, it has one paved road, but it's really long. And it has more villages than any other part of Alaska north of Anchorage. And it has a few restaurants and a few museums, or at least one, and libraries and fire departments. And it has many fewer life-threatening perils for humans, especially for solo travelers, which is why I thought it would be a good place for me to go on my own. But on my very first day, I was given the first warning of danger. I stopped first at Turn Again Arm View B&B, and I was gazing down. Honestly, I was actually drooling down onto the wonderful meal the waitress had just brought me. And suddenly, every single patron in the restaurant stood up and rushed outdoors. I couldn't figure out what was going on. A fire? No, it was a tidal bore, the famous Turn Again tidal bore. And it was coming in at that very minute. And the waitress said people come from all over to watch it or walk in it or surf on it. The breaking waves just pour in along that long, narrow, and shallow inlet, and they can be anywhere from 6 inches to 6 feet high. They can move at 6 miles an hour to 24 miles an hour, depending on a lot of factors like time of year or phases of the tides or shifting mud and sand, melting icebergs, etc. But my food had just arrived and it looked good, and I stayed put, and I just watched the tide come in through my window. It appeared to be only a foot high that day. So when I finished my excellent meal, I asked the waitress about 2 nearby hiking trails that I wanted to try, and her eyes got huge. She started shaking her head vehemently. No, 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 she said. Kodiak bears are just waking up, and they are hungry and they are ill-tempered. They are one of the 2 largest bear species alive today. On average, they're even bigger than grizzlies. And a woman and her son had been attacked by one just a few days ago, only 5 miles away from where I was sitting. One should hike alone, the waitress said. I should go along with a group of at least 4, preferably more, or don't go at all. Suddenly the waitress frowned. You are alone, right? You planning on being alone your whole visit? I said, yes. You're not here in Alaska looking for a man? I laughed. No. Good, she said. Alaska has always had more men than women, so some gals think it's a great place to go looking. But I'm telling you, girl, the odds are good, but the goods are odd. And that was my first Alaskan adage. So I had been chowing down during all the boar excitement at the restaurant. So just a little further down, I turned off the road at a sign that said Tidal Boar Viewing Spot, Turnout 4. And this map shows several good viewing spots and also gives a really good idea of the rugged topography here. There was a long, wide expanse of dark gray sand, and it just looked like an invitation for a stroll. Then I saw a sign. The sign said, do not even think of stepping here. Volcanic ash, quicksand, it will suck you to your death. So that was my second warning. And apparently it sucks you to your death very fast. There's almost no chance of rescue. So I didn't take a walk there either. I stopped again at the picturesque and sort of touristy town of Girdwood. It's sort of like an Alaskan Stowe. It's small, but touristy, to stretch my legs. And I spent some time chatting with a couple from Virginia. And they were birders, like I am. And they told me there were ptarmigans at Portage Glacier. Well, I had never seen a ptarmigan. It's a kind of grouse. And a quick check of that handy guidebook showed me that I was going to pass right by Portage Glacier on my way to my next stop, ptarmigans. So a very short while later, I pulled off the road in an area with not a building or a car or a power pole or any sign of humans anywhere in sight. But there was a glacier, and it was right next to the road. I couldn't see any ptarmigans. I couldn't see any birds of any sort. So I got out of the car and I cautiously stepped over a little ditch and onto the glacier. Well, it was raining sort of a sleet at the time. The glacier, wet ice is extremely slippery. And I immediately fell and I immediately slid right into the little ditch, which was full of ice water. So there was warning 3 already. I lurched, sopping wet and icy cold, back to the rental car, and I turned the heat and the fan up to high. But before I left, I was rewarded by a very odd, special bird noise. It was a varied thrush. These interesting looking birds related to our robins do that. They try one note and then they don't like that. And they try a different note and they don't like that one either. They just keep trying over and over. So I headed on to the Kenai Peninsula around the end of Ptarmigan Arm to Anchor River Lodge. I would love to see this lovely place again. After a hot shower and a change of clothes, I stepped out on my private little patio to take this photo at 9:30 at night. Even in southern Alaska, early May days are much longer than here in Vermont. So I had plans to go birding the next day with a very well-known guide named Ken Marlowe, But I'd driven a lot that day, and I looked at the map and realized how many miles there were between where I was and where he wanted to go birding. And I called him and canceled. And he suggested I might want to hire his daughter when I got to Seward later in the trip. So it was a good idea. So my hosts here at Anchor River Lodge were competent and jolly and attentive without being effusive at all. It was a wonderful stay, and the breakfasts were amazing. But on the second morning, our hostess heard on the radio that a young woman jogger had been killed by wolves not very far from where we were. So another warning about taking solo walks. Following my trusty guidebook, I stopped on my way to Homer at Deep Creek Recreation Area, and I spent 2 hours there just scanning the creek and getting really good looks at dunlin and black-bellied plovers in full breeding plumage. They're the two shorebirds in the upper right corner. And I saw short-billed dowitchers and least sandpipers and a common merganser and many bald eagles, which are sort of the Alaskan state bird. And in the marsh were mallards and green-winged teal, like the picture in the bottom left, and northern pintails, one of my favorite ducks. They're called the greyhound of waterfowl because they're so streamlined. There's a northern pintail next to the mallard in the upper left photo. And on the beach were mew gulls, which we don't get here, and a common loon, and my first ever glaucous winged gull, and a pair of beautiful harlequin ducks, red-necked grebes, and a raft of white-winged scoters. And all these birds of marsh and creek and beach and ocean were in an area about the size of my backyard. After that wonderful stop, I drove into Homer. I had made reservations at the Alaska Ridgetop Inn, very well named because it was way up on one of the ridges overlooking the town. The town had no snow left in it. There was lots of snow up on the ridgetop, and the long downhill driveway was horrendous. I just left the car up on the road, and I waited and slithered and slid down, and I was met at the door by the wonderful owner. She was holding my deposit check in her hand. She said, "Take this back. I've found a really great place for you in Homer." She downtown Homer. She told me that the hoped for thaw just hadn't come when it was supposed to, and she didn't want me to have to deal with the snow. And it was so lucky. I was only the second guest in this brand new rental yurt. It was much closer to festival headquarters than the Hillside Inn. And it had a full kitchen, so I can make many of my meals. It was ideal. I can't believe how perfect that turned out. And the owners were musicians, so I had time to talk to them about making CDs. It was really fun. And it had a daily moose. My yurt had a moose. This animal wandered down every morning and then sat on the lawn while I had breakfast. Alaska weather, the yurt owner told me, always does what it wants to do. And this was my second adage. Some years, spring is June, summer is July, autumn is August, and all the rest is winter. Homer is a really interesting little town. It's an active port. It has a year-round population of around 5,000, but many more in the summer. And it has this 5-mile-long thing called Homer Spit. And it's very touristy. It has eateries and souvenir shops and sign up for plane trips to see bears, Kodiak bears down here. Has charter fishing boats. It's all bumper-to-bumper traffic in the summer. By the way, this picture shows where I would have stayed up there with all that snow if that nice woman hadn't found me the yurt. But I lucked out. It's not bumper-to-bumper traffic in May. In fact, when I drove out the Homer Spit the first time, this was about the only other thing on it, this haughty individual. I thought it was a carving for tourists until it turned its head, glared at me, and then flew away. So I mentioned that I had timed this whole trip around the Kachemak Bay Shorebird Festival. Most of the shorebirds were late that year.
They were around in small numbers. I'd already seen some at Deep Creek, but not in these huge swirling masses that I was looking forward to. But the people running the festival were great, and I had signed up for 3 pelagic outings, boat outings out into Kachemak Bay, and I have never in my life been unhappy on a boat. And I don't think anyone, unless you get seasick, could be unhappy with scenery like this all around you. And this. It just speaks of wilderness to me. On one trip, we were completely surrounded by tufted puffins, relatives of the Atlantic puffins, but it was very windy that day, and I couldn't get a single clear picture. I did get a few photos, and this is not really clear either, of some of the thousands of common murres that were surrounding the boat. And we got really close to these surf birds. These were one of several life list birds for me, birds I'd never seen before. I also saw huge breeding colonies of black-legged kittiwakes. They're smaller relatives of gulls. There were literally thousands and thousands of kittiwakes right over our head. This huge Steller's sea lion bull roared his displeasure at the approaching boat. And the birds in this photo are a pelagic cormorant. That's a kind we don't have here. And glaucous or glaucous-winged gulls or hybrids. The boat captain, who was very knowledgeable, said you really can't tell. There's a lot of hybridization going on there. Sea otters got really close to us on one of the trips. Again, it was a very windy outing, so I didn't get a really clear picture, but they are so cute. We also got one look on this very windy outing also of a Kodiak bear. It was walking along across a very steep hill, apparently stalking some mountain goats. And I have to say that the mountain goats looked completely nonchalant. They knew that they could just whirl on a dime and leap up that very steep, craggy slope so much faster than a Kodiak, even though the bears are fast. So this is Max. Max is a bearded collie. Usually, Max spends most of every boat trip in the pilot house. But the very second that the captain slows the boat, Max rockets through the cabin and races around to the bow where he puts his feet on the railing and starts making noises I have never, ever heard a dog make. It's like, oh, like that. And the captain says that Max calls whales. And sure enough, he called up 4 humpback whales and a minke whale for us. And the minute one of the large creatures, huge creatures, appeared, Max would start making typical doggy noises. He'd bark and his tail would just wag furiously. On one of the boats, I was chatting with a man who's lived there for about 15 years. And he asked me if I had noticed, he told me I should notice, the signs on the road out of Homer, the signs that say tsunami evacuation route. I had noticed them. And he said he'd been in one evacuation, and he added, with typical Alaskan stoicism, it was sort of scary. So the day after the end, did you have a question? Well, that was a laugh, not a question. Sort of scary. The day after the end of the Shorebird Festival with almost no shorebirds, I packed up and said a fond goodbye to the yurt owners, and I drove out of Homer on the only road going across the peninsula. I stopped on the way to walk, finally, to get a walk, and bird on the Kenai Trail. And notice how that's spelled, the Kenai Trail at the Kenai Peninsula National Wildlife Refuge. And there were signs telling people what to do if they came across a Kodiak bear, but the rangers told me that no bears had been seen on those trails in several years, so I did take a walk. And I was greeted by Kenneth jays and rusty blackbirds. By the way, I took most of the photos in this whole presentation, but I've supplemented them with pictures taken by birding friends when I didn't end up with a good enough image of some bird to share. Driving across the peninsula, I was struck by the isolation and the loneliness. I mean, I have seen isolated homes in the high sage desert of southeastern Oregon and in western Texas and in New Mexico. But that little owner-designed, owner-built house that was all out of scrap metal really rivaled them all. When I stopped for gas, this man with a huge Grizzly Adams beard and a bigger, just a minute, we got a chat. Let me just see if there's something new. Oh, you're saying, George, we can hear you on the phone. Yes. His huge smile, and he gave me another Alaska adage. He said, two kinds of people live in Alaska. One is running towards something rather, and the other is running away from something. And he said, I'm advising you to steer clear of the second kind. And I've heard that quote before about the two kinds of people in Alaska. This all-purpose building where he worked was a gas station, a restaurant, a bar, a liquor store, a motel, and a place to clean both your clothes and yourself, because there just isn't very much there in the middle of Kenai Peninsula. So my last 6 nights in the Kenai Peninsula were just outside Seward, which is on the eastern coast of the peninsula, in a little cottage named Angel's Rest. And Seward has tourists like Homer, but I thought it had a much more relaxed sort of hometown feeling. It feels as if the main purpose of the town is to be there for year-round residents, rather than the visitors who come only in the relatively few winter months. I took very few photos in Seward because it was either raining or sleeting all the time I was there. This is one of the clearest days. I was looking out my little cottage onto a fjord called Resurrection Bay. The bay was named for a Russian explorer who had to retreat from the Bay of Alaska during a horrendous storm. And when the many-day storm finally ended, it was on Easter Sunday, and the explorer named the area Resurrection Bay. But one foggy and rainy morning, I was cheered up by two astonishingly beautiful, loud songs right outside my cottage. And I went outside and saw two different subspecies of fox sparrows. This red or taiga bird and a sooty fox sparrow also. So after spending an entire day in the cottage, reading and doing crossword puzzles, which I could do at home, I decided the Alaska Sea Life Center might be a great way to spend the rainy afternoon. And it really was. I would recommend it to anybody. My favorite memory is looking at a pair of long-tailed ducks from only a few feet away and being able to listen to the male's soft comments to his mate. And the next day, I met up with the daughter of the guide that I'd contacted earlier, and it turned out that her father was visiting. So they both took me out for an entire day of visiting with two master birders and two professional guides. And even with cold and sleet, it was a truly marvelous experience. Ken and his daughter Leanne were funny and warm and affectionate with each other and incredibly knowledgeable. And I still grin when I remember Leanne driving the car right out on the runway at Seward Airport, on the runway, and murmuring, "No problem, they know me." We saw great birds in the wetlands at the end of the runway, including a very rare Smith's longspur, which excited even the two guides. And I was very impressed by Leanne's calm and amused acceptance of the area's natural dangers. She told me about coming upon an avalanche while the cloud of drifting snow was still in the air, seconds after tons and tons of snow and ice had covered the road. She and her two little girls were not injured, and the car was only slightly dented, but they got stuck on the far side of the avalanche, and they couldn't get home for 3 days. And in this picture, you can see some trucks that weren't as lucky that actually got caught in the avalanche. So Kenai might be Alaska light, but it still takes a really hardy person to live there. I made one more stop, a birding stop, as I headed back toward Anchorage at the famous Potter Marsh. Potter Marsh is home of the annual Anchorage Audubon Birding Smackdown. And the descriptions of the smackdown are in line with the overall Alaskan pride in being tough. Birders have to abide by rules about where to bird and how many hours to bird and what counts as proof for any rare birds. However, if you meet up with any other group and you think they're keeping a secret from you, you are allowed to use, quote, extraordinary interrogation methods, unquote. At Potter Marsh, I got really close looks at a male and female barrow's golden eyes. These are species we rarely see in Vermont, and gorgeous little Arctic terns. And this pair appeared to be either courting or they were already choosing their nesting site. And so that was a real treat. Now, to someplace even more remote. I had wanted to see tundra, real tundra for ages. So I decided Churchill, Manitoba was the place to go. But I couldn't decide how to go. I really love solo birding trips rather than going with others. But I was and still am daunted by the logistics of either taking a very long train ride from Winnipeg on a train that very often doesn't run because the track is under either water or snow, or flying, also a very long trip, in a tiny 2-engine World War II plane, and then ending up in a village with no convenient rental car place right at the airport. And then if I could find a personal, a private truck or ATV to rent, I would be driving alone on pitted dirt roads with very few signs. The roads are famous for being unexpectedly underwater, no cell phone coverage, polar bears circling my car. I kept having these images, so I decided to go with a tour company. And I asked for advice on the Vermont Birders Listserv, and I got really helpful email, and I decided to go with Victor Emmanuel Nature Tours, or VENT, V-E-N-T. Obviously, VENT doesn't transport its own vehicles to Churchill, so they have a long-term relationship with this North Star bus tours, which mostly takes people out to see polar bears in the fall. And I really liked the fact that the hearty sit-down breakfasts and sit-down dinners are included in the cost of any VENT tour, as well as personalized box lunches. And I really think that packed field lunches in a nice place like this add to the sense of camaraderie. And it's so much nicer than just letting everyone duck into a Subway or a convenience store, which they don't have up there anyway. And as a clincher, I'd read a lot about the leader. He was a retired biological sciences professor and a leading expert on tundra, birds and plants and wildlife, and had been to Churchill over 20 times. So I knew that he would find us great things. Many people have heard of Churchill only as a place to see polar bears. And there are many signs like the one on the left, polar bear alert, stop, do not walk here, all over the place. But I found that Churchill is also set among staggering beauty. So I'm delighted to show you some of these memories, the beauty and the oddities. One of my favorite memories is standing on the ancient rocks of Cape Mary, where the Churchill River flows into the Hudson Bay. We were first there at 9:30 at 10 at night, but that beautiful sweet light that I always associate with late afternoon was just bathing the huge field of bedrock. Hudson Bay, as you see right there, was full of icebergs, but there was enough open water so there were beluga whales sliding by, along with big brown bearded seals. And the air was full of the sounds of gulls and terns and ducks. A parasitic jaeger appeared, doing its parasitic thing and trying to steal a fish from a Sabine's gull. This photo was taken by a professional photographer, a friend of our guides who joined us for a few hours that day. The jaeger is the bird on the right. We watched it and that tiny gull whirling and racing and diving and swooping for over 5 minutes.
And then the bigger gull on the left, I don't know what species it is, joined, and the Jaeger took off. The second memory is Churchill itself. Not going to win any awards for beauty. It has an end of nowhere look. It feels like a frontier, and it is a frontier town. But there is a large civic center that includes a movie house, a cafeteria, a library, hospital, health center, swimming pool, ice rink, indoor playground, gym, and basketball courts, all covered with covered passageway so the residents can go from one to the other in the winter without having to go outdoors. And there are several inns and motels, mostly for the bear watchers who come in October and November, when the polar bears pass through town. We stayed at the Tundra Inn, which had very comfortable rooms with private baths and that nice meeting area where we could meet up every evening and talk about what we've seen. Churchill is accessible by train and plane many days of the year, but you can't count on any day. Depends on the weather. It can be reached by boat only a few months of the year, although that amount of time has been increasing with global warming. My next memory is the cold. The first 3 days of our stay were cold. This is on June 11th. I'm wearing a turtleneck shirt, 2 polypro pullovers, 2 flannel shirts, a fleece vest, the big waterproof anorak, long undies, heavy corduroy pants, wind and rain pants, wool socks, and insulated winter hiking boots. And this birder came really prepared. He came with a complete snowmobile outfit, so you didn't see anything but his eyes. The rocks, by the way, all over were smoothed and carved by wind and water and covered by many different lichens, large red-orange patches, smaller bits of almost black, yellowish green, and white. Memory 4, Churchill, really surprised me, is a very multicultural little town. The family that owned this wonderful gypsies restaurant was from Cuba, and the efficient and accommodating mother of the family, Helen, called her young Chinese waitress muchacha, and one of the long-term waiters spoke fluent French as well as English and a few other languages. Gypsy's restaurant burned to the ground a few years ago, and it makes me sad every time I think of it because it was just such a wonderful and welcoming place. This area was first settled by Thule people, ancestors of the modern Inuits, and Chippewa and Cree people arrived later. And there's also a Métis heritage hall in town. The Métis are an ethnic group with both Indigenous and French Canadian roots. And they're famous for folk music that reflects First Nations heritage, along with Scots and French Canadian. Memory 5 is walking along this wooded trail and getting really good looks at spruce grouse. That was getting very good looks at us. And then we started noticing on the way back spruce grouse droppings everywhere. And one of the birders suggested that we should package the dried droppings as a trail snack and call it boreal crunch, which is a fairly disgusting idea. Memory 6 is 2 days of relative warmth. A few days after we got to Churchill, there were 2 full days when temperatures reached the high 50s, and I think it hit low 60 one day, late afternoon. And I think every single person in Churchill rushed to be outdoors. This was a town hungry for warmth. Memory 7 is ptarmigans, finally. I had hoped to see one in Alaska 2 years earlier, but I had not. And right outside Churchill, I saw my life list willow ptarmigan flying towards us with white wings flashing. Later, we had much longer ptarmigan encounters. This alert male was guarding his mate, who's hidden back there in the scrubby undergrowth, sitting on a nest. These are the birds that turn completely white in the winter. They were in the process of changing from their winter camouflage to summer camouflage. I love their eyebrows stand up, by the way, when they're alert or on guard. This willow ptarmigan entertained all of us by going through a remarkable repertoire of sounds, some of them very human sounding. He clearly was telling our van, go back, go back, go back, go back, go back, go back, go back. Memory 8 was a surprise of seeing that I know well. This is an American tree sparrow. They're at our feeders all winter long, but I'd never heard one sing, and that's because they only sing on their breeding territory. So getting to hear and see it at the same time was like getting to know an old friend in an unexpected way. Several of us spent an hour or more in one afternoon in this museum, which is full of intricate carvings done in whalebone and walrus ivory. The Insanipac Museum has some of the finest and oldest Inuit carvings and artifacts in the world, dating from 1700 BC, which is just astonishing. And you've got to feel bad for this person down here being munched by the polar bear.
Seems pretty happy about it too.
Well, I don't know if he was smiling or if that's something that's holding it onto that. I can't tell. It does look like he's smiling, but I doubt if he would be. In a place where it's so difficult to get anything new, old things get reused. That cargo plane in the upper left is nicknamed Miss Piggy. I'm not sure why, but she went down many years ago, miraculously with no lives lost. And now she is being taken apart slowly as people need a bit of metal for some project. And the ship at the bottom of the slide, the SS Ithaca, ran aground in 1960, and she's also being slowly taken apart. Again, with no lives lost, that was. And I don't know the story of the other ship the other ship there on the left, but it too is being slowly dismantled by local people who would much prefer using materials close at hand to having to order from far away. One day we were driving along and we noticed an animal, not a bird, in a yard next to the road. And Jerry stopped the van and we all got out and consulted field guides, trying to decide if the animal was a snowshoe hare or an Arctic hare. And then the owner came out and he was a delight. Bill took us into the back yard where he had lots of bird feeders with pine grosbeaks and dark-eyed juncos and common redpolls. And he pointed out to us that the basement windows of his house all had bars on them to keep out polar bears. But he said one time, 2 of the huge white bears had broken down his heavy front door and gotten right into his house. And they ate my jelly beans, he said, and they were jelly bellies. That's the good kind. I think I'd have more worries than my jelly bellies. In 2 places outside Churchill, we came across fields with 20 to 60 sled dogs, each with its own little shelter. These dogs are not pets, as you can tell from the expression on the blonde one there. Sled dogs live their entire lives away from people's homes, visited by their owners only to be fed, trained, and harnessed up. During polar bear migration, tourists can hire some owners of sled dog teams to take them right out on the tundra. Many locals, though, think this fairly new practice is foolhardy, but it is bringing in good money for the dog owners. Most polar bear tourists go out into the tundra on vehicles like this. Bear tourism is the biggest industry in Churchill. And there were shorebirds. I didn't see shorebirds at the Shorebird Festival, but the tundra is where millions and millions of shorebirds go to nest. Yellowlegs showed off their legs, of course. Wilson's snipes were winnowing everywhere. A Hudsonian godwit perched on the top of a little conifer tree, looking impossibly unbalanced, but he stayed there for ages, guarding his nesting female. Here's our shorebird list. Shorebirds away from Hudson Bay, on the tundra, not next to any shores at all, because that's where they nest. Inukshuk, or Inukshuk rather, is a word that means sort of loosely a thing that acts in the capacity of a human. Inukshuks mark travel routes or tell others about fishing places or camps or available food, etc.
And sometimes an inukshuk is just a pile of stones, like a cairn, but often they're made to look like a person. And to me, those symbolize this part of the world. One day, the guide Jerry led most of the group across springy mosses and lichens to find a Harris's sparrow, another kind we don't see here in Vermont. Some of the birders stayed with the van because they weren't comfortable even about the idea of heading into a bog with all that uneven and squishy footing. This was one of the gorgeous days. The temperatures were in the high 50s, warm southerly breeze, and every step filled the air with a delicate, sweet, spicy smell. And finally, the Harris's sparrow flew to a tree between us and the road, and then very kindly flew right over the van. So everyone in the group got a look at it. It was one of many sparrows that we saw on the trip, including that beautiful little junco in the bottom right. There are several areas outside Churchill that are off limits because they are or used to be associated with military installations. There were bases for U.S. Army Air Forces, the Royal Canadian Air Force, a strategic air command, and there was the Churchill rocket range. The first fort was built way back in 1717, but it's been used for defense ever since then. This abandoned bunker is a reminder of the area's sort of more recent military importance. Now, some of the old military buildings are part of a fascinating non-governmental institution called the Churchill Northern Studies Center. For a surprisingly low fee, researchers can stay there at the center, enjoy excellent meals, private rooms, have free use of tundra vehicles, work in well-equipped laboratories, and carry on projects relating to the far north. And they can be hooked up to the internet. Notice the cell towers in this picture. Some recent studies that have happened there are mapping Arctic wildflowers and boreal plants, food availability for plovers, barcoding aquatic insects, habitat selection by female polar bears, etc. And they're doing a long-term study of habitat alteration due to increased numbers of geese. Populations of both Canada geese and snow geese have exploded worldwide. And these big birds walking around with their big feet are contributing to the failure of many shorebird nests and also to some basic habitat changes in the tundra itself. Well, as I mentioned, polar bears are one of Churchill's main claims to fame, but they're rarely seen in that area in May or June when we were there. However, past midnight on our third night, a loud alarm sounded throughout the town. It was the polar bear alert. A skinny old bear was ambling down the main street. The volunteer bear brigade left their homes and chased the critter out of town. And several of our group saw the bear from the windows in their rooms. I couldn't see it from my window. And back to the first memory, the sheer beauty. The ancient and beautiful rock around Hudson Bay, smoothed by billions of years of water and wind. Bedrock in northern Manitoba is estimated to be between 1.7 and 2.8 billion years old, some of the oldest visible rock on the whole planet. The wild and humbling glory of rock and water and ice and sky. I felt astonished and uplifted when I stood on these rocks, and I can still feel uplifted now when I look at the photos. And the tundra, the endlessness of the tundra, as far as we could see. There are thousands and thousands of square miles of tundra all across northern Canada, an expanse that I find difficult to grasp. It was beautiful on cold and misty days even. Vast areas in which very few humans have ever walked about. The tundra, like so many desert landscapes, might look uniform, but like deserts, it's really diverse and a complicated habitat that hides a wealth of diverse flora and much unexpected beauty. And the tundra sort of looks empty when you look at it, but in all those countless miles, there are millions, literally,
of shorebirds of 22 different species. There are also millions of nesting ducks and geese, loons and swans. I was very startled, by the way, to see mallards that far north. I don't know why, I just didn't expect them to be up there. And more nesting ducks and geese, and gulls and terns. And even more kind of birds that nest on the far northern tundra. I was particularly startled to see the 5 species of warblers in that right-hand column. I just don't think of them as northern creatures at all. And the robins, to see American robins walking around in Churchill. And the swamp birds were another surprise for me. Sandhill cranes and American bitterns. And in addition to all those species, others also nest on the tundra around Churchill, Manitoba. Golden eagles, they don't have the bald eagles that are down in that I saw in Alaska. Peregrine falcons, almost 4 dozen species of songbirds, 4 kinds of woodpeckers, and 4 kinds of owls, including snowy owls. Well, I went to Churchill because I wanted to experience tundra, to walk on it, to breathe it in, and I wanted to see the birds of the tundra. And I got so much more than I'd expected or hoped for. I would love to, in the words of this willow ptarmigan, go back, go back, go back, go back, go back, go back, go back. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Maeve. It was great.
Thank you. Any questions or comments about visiting either of these 2 places? Okay, well, thank you. And it's sunny outdoors, although it's very, very wickedly cold right now.
Yeah. Thanks for doing this. Sorry for all the trouble at the beginning, but it was worth waiting for.
Good.
It was a lovely story, Maeve. Lovely story.
Thank you so much. I love those 2 trips.